Good afternoon and welcome to the 15th Annual Emma Lazarus Statue of Liberty Award Ceremony. I'm Dan Kaplan, and particularly today, I'm thrilled to be president of the American Jewish Historical Society. We collect, preserve the records and contributions of the American Jewish community in America and south of America. Since the 16th century until the current time, behind our walls are the records of innumerable community organizations, collections of educators, philanthropy, science, sports, and the art. In addition, we house the largest collection of the records of the American Soviet Jewry movement. If you haven't had a chance, please one day come down to our home on 16th Street. It is truly an intellectual wonderland. I am very pleased to recognize some of the very distinguished guests that are attending today's luncheon. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Mayor Ed Koch, my friend and former Secretary of Treasury Paul O'Neill, Ambassador Gabriela Shaliv at the United Nations for Israel, and John Bradamus. Many of you know him.
I do know that for the mood and morale of Soviet Jews, they were vitally important. The knowledge that the United States stood with them in their struggle was extraordinarily powerful. And there are few American officials who embody that support more than George Shultz. No words are sufficient to describe the central role he played or the message he sent when, as Secretary of State, he hosted a Passover Seder for Soviet Jewish activists at the American Embassy in Moscow in 1987. At a moment when the world needs symbols of hope and possibility, today's lunch couldn't be better timed. It's a perfect reminder of the power of individuals to dream dreams and fulfill them, as Soviet Jews did, and of the capacity of true statesmen to chart a brighter future and achieve it, as our two distinguished guests did so magnificently. And now, it's my privilege to introduce to you Secretary of State George Shultz, a former recipient of the Emma Lazarus Statue of Liberty Award. His outstanding record of service is reflected by the many honors he has received. In fact, tonight, Captain George Shultz, United States Marine Corps, will receive the Marine Corps' Commandant's Award. This afternoon, Secretary Shultz will present the Emma Lazarus Award to Ken Bialkin, with whom he has shared an enduring friendship, commitment to the values of freedom, and years of service to the cause of Soviet Jewry. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary of State George Shultz.
So, Ken, I consider it a great honor to give you this award. It's the Lazarus Statue of Liberty Award to my friend Ken Bialkin, and in recognition of the work he has done and the continuing effort to make a clear archival record of it so that future generations can understand it well.
Coming from you, an American hero and a personal hero of mine, receipt of this honor becomes even more precious to me.
As we all know, President Gorbachev's leadership was so vitally important in bringing the Cold War to an end. Today we honor another of his major accomplishments, his historic role in opening the doors of the Soviet Union to permit hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews to leave and emigrate to countries of their choice. President Gorbachev, the American Jewish Historical Society is very proud to award you our first Global Leadership Award.
Я уже много раз убеждался в своей длинной жизни, политической деятельности, что когда участвуешь в каком-то мероприятии, приезжаешь для того, чтобы понять все, то только на самом этом собрании, проникнутом воспоминаниями, по самым больным вопросам нашей жизни, я наконец понял, зачем я здесь и ваши отношения ко мне.
As I have learned during my life and political career, when you come to some event, it's only during the event itself, when you hear the people, hear their recollections and their views, that you finally understand the meaning of that event. And so I've understood now why I'm here.
Ну, я думаю, время все поставит на место.
I think with time that will be changing.
Благодарю за награду.
I thank you for this award.
Такой еще награды у меня не было.
I have not had this kind of an award yet.
Наград действительно много.
I have had many awards.
Я принимаю их с большой благодарностью от людей, от организаций, от государств.
I always
Ибо наши общие усилия, наше понимание, взаимная поддержка – это то, на чем мы будем создавать в рамках глобального уже мира новые системы, новые демократические институты, что будет помогать нам избавляться от трудностей.
I always accept such awards with gratitude because I believe that they represent a desire for cooperation, for mutual understanding, for mutual support. And that is what we need in order to build a global world, and in this global world, the kind of institutions, the kind of structures that will help us to cope with any problems and
Я
difficulties.
буду заканчивать, ибо нам, Жоржем, еще вести
I'll be
разговор
concluding
перед
these
вами.
remarks because we will now be having a dialogue with George Shultz in your
Спасибо.
presence.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
This year marks the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We talked this evening with two of the pivotal figures who helped shape that momentous period, the president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Secretary of State, George Shultz, who worked alongside Ronald Reagan. Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, is credited with his pursuit of perestroika and glasnost, two reforms that modernized and opened up his country. George Shultz, who was Secretary of State from 1982 to 1989, was a key member of President Ronald Reagan's foreign policy team. He was closely involved in the decision to confront the Soviets before engaging with them and reaching landmark arms control agreements. I recently spoke to both of them here in New York, where Gorbachev was honored by the American Jewish Historical Society for his effort in bringing Soviet Jewry to Israel and other places. Here is a look at that conversation. What were your feelings when the Berlin Wall came down?
When it happened,
Мы уже понимали,
we already understood
мы накануне
that we were on the eve
важных свершений.
of important developments.
Люди генералы
People
выходили с площадей,
in East Germany, in the
требовали
GDR,
объединения.
were rallying in public squares.
А ведь еще в июне месяце мы
They
встречались с Хельмутом
demanded
Колем.
unification, whereas just a few months before, in July of that same year, we were having a meeting with Helmut Kohl, and when we were asked when would Germany unify, we said this is a problem for the 21st century. So to the television viewers and to the people here, I will say that you have to take all of those predictions with a grain of salt, because history has seen many unexpected turns because of what the people did. So the Germans were standing practically round the clock in public squares demanding unification. I visited in October East Germany to participate in observing the 40th anniversary of the GDR. There was a torch procession, a torch march, in which mostly young and people participated. They were singing songs, but they were also chanting slogans. We want unification. Gorbachev, help us. The Prime Minister of Poland, Mieczysław Rakowski, came up to me and said, President, this is the end. Yes, the end of one era and the beginning of another. And the wall was the fall of the wall was something that we expected.
When President Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall, what did you think?
Well, this did not really impress us, as it did you. We knew very well that the first profession of President Reagan was an actor, a performer. So he did a performance. But nevertheless, this does not diminish the role and the importance in these processes of President Reagan. When we were talking with George this morning, recalling the summit in Geneva, I recall that after our first one-on-one meeting with President Reagan, both of us went back to our delegations, and I was asked by my delegation, what is your impression? And I said, well, he's a real dinosaur. And we learned a week later in Newsweek magazine that the same question was put by the American delegation to President Reagan, and he said Gorbachev is a die-hard Bolshevik. But then, 2 days later, we adopted a statement that, in particular, our ministers of foreign affairs had worked on, and that said, nuclear war is unacceptable and it cannot be won and must never be fought. And for those words alone, it was worth it to meet. So Reagan definitely was a person who played a very important role, but of course, together with him, next to him was Shultz, and next to me was Shevardnadze. Those two persons played a very important role in all of those things.
And the dream of doing something about nuclear weapons continues. Secretary Shultz, when many things happened because of you and President Reagan.
Aren't you going to ask me what I thought when the Berlin Wall went down?
Yeah, yes, I was. But I'd actually liked I'd like to do the questions and you do the answers, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
This is a long friendship. I want to build to that. But I recognize a good producer when I see one. What did you think? First, when President Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear that wall, and secondly, when in fact it happened.
I thought the president's statement was dramatic, but I think almost everybody who went to Berlin, including me, and you look at the wall, you said, tear down that wall. It was a common instinctive reaction to something artificial. And sometimes your reaction has a personal dimension. One of my closest friends is Helmut Schmidt, who visited me in California when he was chancellor. And I knew that he liked Bach. And in Carmel, there is a Bach festival every year. So we went down there, stayed at a nice house nearby. And at the intermission, they had a special room for him as head of government. And they invited some of the musicians. The most outstanding musician was a violinist from East Germany. And he and Helmut started to talk. And afterwards, Helmut said to me, do you suppose we could invite him to come to our house after the concert? And I said, yeah, I think we could, but we ought to invite maybe 3 or 4 other people too, so he isn't picked out. And so they came, and I talked to the others, and I saw Helmut and this East German violinist, outstanding musician, talking. Tears streaming down their face. Because this man was allowed and encouraged to go out and play, but never could take his family. They were the hostages that made him come back. And then I talked almost the rest of the night with Helmut about it after they left. And it left me very deeply convinced that somehow this division of Germany could not stand up over time. And so the wall coming down kind of meant that to me, but it also was a symbol of the power of the idea of freedom. And I wasn't, everybody was sort of surprised, but in a way I wasn't so surprised because I had sat with President Gorbachev many times and I had seen his thinking evolve. It was a natural progression, not a sudden thing.
Had you seen an evolution in President Reagan's thinking?
Well, President Reagan, of course, always stood for freedom right from the beginning. That was his theme.
I meant about the Soviet Union.
And he always wanted to meet with Soviet leaders, but the first one that he was able to meet with was President Gorbachev in Geneva. And it was a big moment for him because he found in the course of 2 or 3 private meetings with you and then the plenary that this is a man I can talk to. I can have a conversation with him. I think you had fireside conversations, if I'm not mistaken. So I think one of the big reasons why change takes place is that people who are in leadership believe it can take place. Sometimes people are convinced that this is the way it is and that's it. It can't change. But if some leaders come along who think change is possible, then it becomes possible sometimes.
Right. President Gorbachev, what was your first impression of President Reagan?
First of all, I had a general impression, as many other people in the Soviet Union, that the President of the United States is a hawk, an aggressive hawk, a person who would like to put America in a preeminent position. And that was a common view. When I met with Reagan, when I saw him, when we talked, I began to think that we will probably get along. I don't know how that happens. I don't know whether it's a gut feeling or comes from the mind, from the head. George has recalled our various conversations. We had some difficult discussions. We had several one-on-one meetings in Geneva. Then later, sometimes there were occasions such as during one of our visits, President Reagan started to talk to me in a lecturing way, as I felt. And I stopped him and I said, Mr. President, you're not a teacher and I'm not a student here. And even less, you are not a prosecutor and I'm not the accused here. If you intend to deal with me on an equal basis, then I think we can go very far together. If not, then maybe we should wrap it up and finish our conversation. Reagan said that I had misunderstood him. And then soon after that he said, let's go on a first-name basis, Ron and Michael. He wanted